Masechet Gittin, Daf Nun Chet. We're going to finish off the stories about the destruction of Jerusalem, and then we'll get back into the halachic sections of our Mishnah. Benesion haikarim hamesulaim bapaz. Quoting a pasuk from Echa, the precious ones of Sion were comparable to fine gold. My mesulaim bapaz. In what way were the people of Jerusalem comparable to fine gold? Ilema davu mechape befiza v'ha'amri debe rebi shela tarte matkele istere piza nechut ba'alma chada beromi v'chada bechule alma. If you say that the young people in Sion were actually covered with gold, they're all wearing gold, well, that can't possibly be true, because we have a tradition from the school of Rabbi Shela that there were two istera weights of fine gold that came down into the entire world. One of the weights went to Rome. In other words, Rome is very rich, so they have half the gold of the whole world, and the rest was spread evenly among all the other countries of the world. Point being that there isn't so much gold out there, and most of it is in Rome. This is in fact true. I saw a statistic recently that gold is actually quite precious because there's relatively little gold in the whole world. So therefore, there would not possibly be enough gold for all the young people in Jerusalem to be all decked out. Rather, rather means that the young people in Jerusalem were so beautiful that they made fine gold look ugly. They were even more beautiful than gold. Okay, so we're going to see now a couple of stories about the young boys of Jerusalem. We saw a story already about that yesterday on the ship. There were young boys and young girls, and they jumped to their death rather than be taken and abused. So let's see what the story is about that. Before this, the Great Revolt, the Romans, they had a belief that if one looks at a picture of a beautiful person while having relations with his spouse, then the child will look that beautiful. So they would have a seal, a picture of some a beautiful person on their beds while they engaged in relations. However, mikan ve'elach maitu b'nei Israel v'asireh b'chad'eh defuraihu u'mishamesheh. However, from the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and on, when the Romans came and they took as captives these beautiful children, so they, instead of putting a picture, they would tie a kid to their bed and look at the kid, and that way their Roman children would be as beautiful as these Jewish children. So now there's two kids that are both tied up next to each other, and they're talking to each other. And not only are they beautiful, but they're also learned. They're kids. They're studying Torah. And one says to the other, where is this curse written? Right? We saw above a lot of the stories are actually equivalent to Pesukim. Remember, like Marta, she steps on something and she dies because she is the most dainty and pampered of Jerusalem and she can't handle stepping on the floor. So that's explicit pasuk in the curses, and then there's a story about that. So now they're wondering, where was this predicted? This such an unusual form of degradation, even if it's not killing them and not physically as painful as those rakes that we saw before, but really very degrading. So who could imagine such a thing? Where is the source of this in the Torah? So the other child quoted pasuk at the end of Devarim, after all the list of curses, it says, and also sickness and plague, which is not written in the book of Torah, also will come upon them. There's an etc. clause. It says this is what it says, the things that are not written, unspeakable, that this is what it's referring to. The other kid who asked the question in the first place, Amar, Kama merachekna meduchta pelan. He says, how far am I from this, from knowing what you know? You're ahead of me in your studies. Maybe he was a grade older or was more advanced. He says, wow, I didn't know that. I wonder how much more I would have to learn to be as smart as you. Amar le ingad pusta ufalga. The other one said, not very far, 1.5 columns of extra text in Sefer Devarim, and you would have gotten to me, right? You were just a little behind. They know where each other are holding, right? And all you need, you knew the beginnings of the curses, but you just didn't get to the end. A little bit more study, and you would have known it too. And the first kid says, "Yeah, you're right. If only I knew that verse, I wouldn't have had to ask you a question. I could have known it myself," which is a nice musar, a little encouragement to not give up, not say, "Oh, I read most of the book. I don't need to know the rest. I read most of the parasha. Right? How much more is there going to be in the last few pisukim? I did most of the daf. Isn't that enough?" I always wonder, because people listen to daf recordings, and you see how far they get. You can tell on YouTube, right? And not everybody makes it to the end. Okay, so I'm assuming that they learn the end on their own. So that's good. But in other words, just keep going. Maybe the information you need is just on the very next page. And so it's quite a scene here. As they're being degraded in this way, they're speaking about Torah, and they're trying to figure out what is the source of this punishment in the Torah. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel Mishum Rabban Shimon ben Gamaliel May dichtiv ani odolad nafshi mikol benot iri. Shemuel said, name of Rashbag, what's the meaning of this pasuk in Echa? My eye affects my soul because of all the daughters of my city. 400 bate knesiot hayu b'chirach betar. B'chol achat ve'achat hayu ba 400 melamdei tinokot. V'chol echad ve'echad hayu lefanav 400 tinokot shel bet Rabban. He says in Betar, this is the city associated with the fall of the Bar Kokhba revolt. There were 400 synagogues. In every one of them, there were 400 teachers. And every one of the teachers taught 400 students. So that's 400 cubed. That's how many students were just in Betar. Again, a huge number, exaggerated. 400 is a typical number that the Talmud uses when he wants to say a lot. The point is, there were a lot of these devoted and learned students studying Torah, who were all destroyed. And a heartwarming but also a tragic scene of the enemy, the Roman soldiers coming in, and these school children, all they could do was they had their pens, which were sharp, their reeds, and they would start stabbing the soldiers with their pens. They were doing their best to defend themselves. And eventually the enemy prevailed against these little kids with their reed pens, and they, in punishment, they wrapped the children in Torah scrolls and lit them on fire. Okay, and that's the meaning of the pasuk, that my eyes affect my soul, crying and crying for all of these young people and their terrible fate. תנו רבנן, מעשה ברבי יהושע בן חנניה שהלך לכרך גדול שברומי. אמרו לו, תינוק אחד יש בבית האסורים. Another story about a child, and a beautiful child of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah. He went to the big city of Rome. It was probably one of the biggest cities in the world. And he was told there was always a Jewish community there, that there is a child. Tinok doesn't have to mean baby. It means a child. And he is in prison. He is beautiful in appearance, attractive. He has these cute curls arranged in locks. They think they really like that look of a kid with long curly hair, maybe braided. Halach ve'amad al petach bet asurim. Amar mi natan l'mshisa Yaakov Yisrael lebozezim. So he goes to the prison to see. And he, to find this child, and he's so upset. He quotes a sad pasuk from Yeshaya: "Who gave Yaakov over to spoil, Yisrael over to robbers?" Like, how could this happen? That these our children are taken over as captives. Ana otov tinok ve'amad halo Adonai zo hatanu lo velo avu b'drachav haloch velo shameu betorato. This child, he knew by heart the continuation of that very pasuk. The end of the pasuk actually answers the question: who gave over Yaakov to be spoils? Was it not Hashem? He who's against whom we have sinned, and we didn't walk in his ways, and we were not obedient to his laws. In other words, it's not so mysterious. It's because of our own sins. This is why punishment has come upon us, right? Don't blame God. Don't blame the Romans, right? We have to make teshuvah. That's what this child is saying, as he continues the pasuk, and Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah, who thought he was just speaking to himself, is just amazed that this kid is not only beautiful in his appearance and cute hair, but also his knowledge of Tanakh. Amar muftechani bo shemoreh hora'a b'Yisrael ha'avoda shenizaz mikan ad she'efdenu michol mamon sheposkin alav. Rabbi Yoshua says, I am sure that this child will grow up to teach halachic rulings in Israel. And he swears by the temple service. It's just an expression. I mean, actually, the temple service is being stopped at this time. But he's making a swear that I will not move from here until I redeem this child with all the money that any amount that they demand. And in fact, he didn't move from there, and he collected the money and he paid a lot to redeem him. Although we saw before, one of the tikkun olam is that you're not allowed to pay more than a person's standard value. However, we also saw that there are exceptions, and one exception would be someone who's going to be a gadol hador, who's going to be a great leader of the generation. So we have to get together and pay even more for that person. And in fact, not long after, a few days doesn't mean a few days, he's still a child, but right, as he grew in his learning, he in fact became one of the greatest teachers of Israel, Umano Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha. This is the famous Rabbi Ishmael, the colleague of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva had one school, Rabbi Ishmael had the other school, right, which is so important. Ishmael, not a common name nowadays after Islam, but back then there were several people, Jews, rabbis, named Rabbi Ishmael. So it's a good thing that he was redeemed. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all that, the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael and all of his Torah. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Maaseh bibno bibito shel Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha shenishbu l'shnei adonim. Now another story about children and beautiful children, and it's also about a rabbi named Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha. But you'll see from the context that this is not the same one, but rather this is talking about the grandfather of this one. Right? This Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha was a little boy at the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. His grandfather was the Kohen Gadol, also at that time. So it's not coincidence that they have the same name. One is named after the other. Okay, this Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, the Kohen Gadol, he had a son and a daughter who were both taken captive, one to one master and one to a different master. לימים נזדווגו שניהם במקום אחד. זה אומר יש לי עבד ושאין כיופיו בכל העולם. וזה אומר יש לי שפחה שאין בכל העולם כולה כיופייה. One day it just happened to be that the two masters happened to be in the same place at the same time, and they were talking to each other. And the one that captured the boy said, I have this slave boy, his beauty is greater than anybody in the whole world. And the other one said, I have a maidservant, and she is the most unmatched beauty in the whole world. So they said, we have a good idea. How about we mate them together, and then we will split the children, and then they'll be beautiful, and we can use them, sell them, and this is a good business venture. So the two masters had these two captives put into a prison cell together. Now it was at night, so they didn't see each other and didn't know who each other were. Even though they couldn't see each other, and they didn't speak either, they were just thinking to themselves. The boy was thinking, I'm a Kohen, the son of Kohen Gadol, and how can I go and be together with a maidservant? He's assuming that the other person is a captive. Most people who are captives are maidservants, or they become a maidservant by being taken captive. And she was thinking the same thing. I'm from this great lineage of Kohanim. I should go and be together with someone who was captured and is a slave. So, Bachu kol halayla, both of them cried throughout the night, and they didn't touch each other. Kevan she'ala amud hashachar hikiru ze et ze v'naflu ze al ze v'ga'u bebichya ad sheyas'a nishmatan. When the morning arrived, they saw each other and they recognized my brother, my sister, and they fell on each other, burst into tears, and were so sad about this great tragedy that they died. And this is an application of Yirmiya's pasuk. For this I weep, my eye runs down with water. Right, to see such great beauty and lineage and potential all be taken captive and be forced to do unspeakable things and terrible tragedy. Amar Resh Lakish, Ma'aseh b'isha achat v'savenat bat Peniel shema, savenat shekol sofin beyofya, bat Peniel bito shel kohen gadol sheshimesh lifnai v'lifnim. Story about another beautiful young woman. Her name was Safanat Bat Peniel. She's called Safanat because everybody would stare at her because she was so beautiful. She's called the daughter of Peniel because she was the daughter of the Kohen Gadol, and Peniel means panim or bifnim. The father served lifnai v'lifnim in the Kodesh Kodashim, right before God. So Peniel. Shenit alel ba shabai kol halayla. She was taken captive, and her captor abused her all night. Then he said, all right, I'm done with her. I'm going to sell her. And so he wrapped her up in 7 cloaks, I guess to protect anyone else from trying to steal her because she was so beautiful. So therefore, like anything very, very, very valuable, you pack up. So no one takes it. Some guy, a man came, a very ugly man, to be a buyer. Amar lo had any at Yofia, let me see the goods, let me see her beauty. Amar lo reka im ata rose li kach kach she'en keyofia bechol alam kulo. And the seller said, what, you don't believe me? You're good for nothing? If you want to buy her. I'm telling you, there is no one as beautiful in the whole world. Amar lo afal piche, and the buyer says, I believe you, but I want to see. Hifshita shisha chalukim. So he's unwrapping her. He took off 6 of the 7 cloaks. Ushvi'i kerata v'nit palasha ba'efer. The 7th one, she preempted, removed the 7th cloak, and rolled around in ashes, perhaps to dishevel herself so she would look uglier, and then hopefully maybe she wouldn't be bought. So she's now, she makes herself full of ashes. Amra lefanav, Ribono shel olam, im alenu lo hasta, al kedushat shimcha gibor, lama lo tachus. Or she put ashes maybe kind of in mourning, and so to show how sad she is at her fate. And at that point, she cried out in prayer and said, Master of the universe, you've shown no pity on us, but how come you don't show pity about your own holy name and great name? How come you don't have pity on that? In other words, we are called by your name. We are your nation. And so when we are treated so shamefully, this reflects on your name, because everybody said, see, look at God's people. He has no power. He doesn't do anything. So he's just a powerful prayer. She's saying, okay, you don't care about me. Fine, don't care about me. But I represent you. Don't you care about your own reputation? ועליה כונן ירמיה בת עמי חגריסק והתפלשי באפר אבל יחיד עשי לך מספד תמרורים כי פתאום יבוא השודד עלינו עלייך לא נאמר אלא עלינו כי ביכול עלי ועלייך בשודד. And this is an application of Yirmiya's lament when he says, daughter, my people, gird yourself with sackcloth and roll in ashes. So here's the rolling in ashes, right? So a lot of these stories, you could see that the story is made to fulfill exactly the words in the pasuk. Not that these stories didn't happen. Worse happened than these stories, right? But the point of telling these stories in this way is to show that literally all the curses and laments that we find in the Torah and the Nevi'im, they all came true and more. And so the pasuk continues, make yourself mourning as for an only son. Someone who loses an only child, Bar Menan, is the worst grief, than even more than someone who has other children. A bitter lamentation for the spoil has come suddenly upon us, alenu. So the plural alenu is curious. It should be has come upon me. Why has come upon us? If Yirmiyah is speaking, it doesn't say alai, it doesn't say and doesn't say to you, right? If Hashem is speaking or Yirmiyah is speaking, right, this terrible thing happened to you. But it says alenu, us, meaning Hashem is speaking and saying the spoiler, the enemy has come upon us, as if to say the enemy has come not only upon you, the human beings, the Jews, but also upon me. And that's the fulfillment of what she said. This woman, God, the enemy is making not only me shamed, is also shaming you. And so all this is a disgrace and a punishment to Hashem Kivyachol himself. And the hope is that this lament and this prayer would arouse Hashem's pity. ואמר רב יהודה, אמר רב, מה דכתיב, והשקו גבר וביתו, איש ונחלתו. Another sad story that's an application of this pasuk, that they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage. So where do we say that a man and his house are both have done wrong to them? There was some guy who was an apprentice, and his master's wife, he found her pretty, and he had a plan. He wanted to take his master's wife. He was a carpenter's apprentice. Okay, so now he's a student, right? So how is he going to arrange this? So the master, the carpenter, needed to borrow some money. The apprentice happened to have some money. He's learning a trade, but he had money somehow. Now, so he said, send your wife to me, to my house, and I'll lend her the money. Shiger ishto etzlo shaha ima shelosha yamim. So the master sent his wife to him, and the wife stayed with him for 3 days. It's not clear here if the wife was willing or was forced, whatever. So she's there. She doesn't come back home for 3 days. Kadam uba eslo amar lo ishti sheshigati lecha hechan hi. So finally, the apprentice goes to the carpenter. Right, he's like showing up for work, and he says, "Oh, where's my wife? I sent her to you 3 days ago. What happened to her?" Amar lo ani petarti alei. Says, I gave her the money immediately. She went back immediately. But I heard a rumor. V'shamati shatinokot nitalelu ba baderech. I heard that some youth, they abused her on the way home. Now really, he was the one abusing her, committing adultery with her during those 3 days. But now he blamed it on someone else. Amalo ma'aseh. So now the carpenter, he knows carpentry, but he doesn't know much about anything else. So he says, what should I do? What's your advice? Amalo imata shomea la'asati gersha. The apprentice said, my advice, divorce her. Right? What do you want? Look what she was gone through. Look how she was treated. You should divorce her. Amar lo, ketubata meruba. Amar lo, ani alvecha, ten la ketubata. He said, but the ketubah is a big payment. I don't have that kind of money. I can't divorce her. She didn't do anything wrong. She was raped. So she deserves a ketubah. I can't pay it. The apprentice, this evil guy, says, I will lend you the money for the ketubah, right? Big amount, $1 million. So he does. Amad zeh v'geresha halachu unsa'a. So the carpenter divorces his wife with money that he borrowed from the apprentice, and once she's free, the apprentice goes and marries her. Now the time comes that the loan is due, and the carpenter, he gave all the money to his wife. He has no money to pay back. So the apprentice says, listen, I don't want to send you to debtor's prison to be a slave. You come work for me. Right? Beforehand, the apprentice was working for the carpenter, and now we switched roles. Right? You work for me, and you'll work your debt off over many years. And now the tables are turned, literally. And this apprentice and the wife were sitting and eating together, eating dinner, while the carpenter, the previous husband and teacher, he was the waiter making the food and serving them. And he was just tearing and crying so much that his tears would fall into their cups as he was serving them. At that point, the fate of the Jewish people was sealed. In other words, there could be such injustice that going on within the Jewish community. People doing this thing, it's one thing to steal. That's bad. One thing to commit adultery. Very bad. It's each step, but to do this to this guy, and now he has to sit there and live with the adulterer who took his wife and took his house and everything, right? This is all a fulfillment of the pasuk that we started with here, that you take and oppress a person and his home, meaning his wife, right? You take everything that he has. So for this is the final straw. Others say slightly different interpretation for having two wicks in one lamp, euphemism to mean adultery, that she was married to one guy even though she was sleeping with the apprentice at the same time. Now, lakach min sikarikon. Okay, that was the end of the Agadah. Ends with this ditchatem gezardin, right? That's when the final straw was done and the verdict was given. So we kind of started off with Kamsa Bar Kamsa, which might have been the beginning of the political, the Sinat Chinam that led to the Romans, the accusation to the Romans that they are rebelling, right? But the sin itself, which is in this little story that has multiple sins within each other, right? That was the final verdict in Shamayim. But the point of all these stories, one of the many points of the stories, but one of them is that the reason why the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed is not because the Romans are so strong, but rather, as that child said, to be Ishmael, that it's because of our own sins. And while on the one hand that is blaming the victim, but it's also empowering, because it means if it was our fault that this happened to us, then it's also in our power to make teshuvah and thereby rectify the sin and undo that damage and hopefully bring upon ourselves the redemption. Okay, so back to the Mishnah, which said, Lakach min sikarikon. We had the law of the Sikarai that said if after the war, if these Sikarai came and steal someone's land, right, by the threat of a dagger, then the rabbis made a takana that one should buy it back, and you can buy it back first by going to the Sikarikon. First by going to the Baal HaBayit to get his permission, and then going to the Sikarikon. That's rule number one. And the other rule is that you're going to have to pay the Sikarikon whatever they ask for. The Sikarikon generally would not ask for full price because, well, they got it for free. And so they just want to get money and get out of there. And so they would often take like 3/4 of the price. So that the person who bought it could then just go and pay the original rightful owner only the other quarter of what's left. And so that the rightful owner got something. But the interest is that the land of Israel go back into Jewish hands. And so even though the rightful owner is losing out, well, the loss is because of the Romans, and otherwise they would get nothing, and the land would stay in the hands of the Romans. And so, therefore, the rabbi saw the best case scenario in that case would be for someone who can afford it to pay. They're going to pay even a little extra because they're going to have to pay the sikarikon and pay. You can't expect them to pay a full price also to the original owner, but by paying a quarter, so at least it will be back in Jewish hands. All right, that's the law of sikarikon. So now some details about that. Amar Rav lo shanu ela de'amar lo lech hazak ukni aval bishtar kana. When the Mishnah taught that if you go to the Sikarai first and then to the owner, that's invalid, because then it looks like you're forcing the original owner into it. You already got permission from the Sikarai, so you already took possession of the land. Now, what choice does the original owner have? Right? He says, yeah, take it, but inside he doesn't really mean it. So that's not a valid transfer of ownership. Rav explains, but that's only true if the original owner says, go and take it. But if he wrote out a document, then that's a real sale. So even though the buyer went to the Sikarai first and then went to the owner didn't have to sit and write a whole deed of sale. And the fact that he took the time to do that, even though he's going to be paid only a quarter, well, he still might do it because, number one, at least he'll be paid a quarter, and number two, he knows he's not going to get it back on anyhow else, and any way else, and at least it'll be in Jewish hands. So if he went and took the time and took the trouble to actually write a shtar, then you know he really meant it and legally gave the land to this buyer. So that's Rav. Ushmal Amar, Af bishtar nami lo kana ad shichtov lo achrayut. Shmuel says even writing a deed of sale is not sufficient and does not show his full-hearted transfer of ownership unless that original owner writes a guarantee. A guarantee is a clause that says, listen, if it should be repossessed by anybody else, I will cover it. In general, when you sell, that's like is giving title insurance, right? Should there be any prior creditor and they come and take the land, I'll make up the difference. If the original owner is giving this guarantee, then you know 100% for sure he's really fully giving over the right to the land. But just writing a shtar, maybe not. So that's Rav and Shemuel. Tanya kivated Shmuel. We have a braita that seems to prove Shemuel against Rav. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer lakach min ha'isha v'chazav lakach min ha'ish mikacho kayam. Remember in the Mishnah, it compared the sikarikon law to a man and a wife. If a wife brings land into the marriage, a person who wants to buy it has to get her permission first, and only then the husband's permission. The husband is the controlling force while they're married, because if it goes to the husband first and he agrees, then she's going to be like, well, I don't want to start a fight with my husband, so she's like, okay, fine, take it, but she doesn't really mean it. So the cases are parallel. And in that parallel case, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar taught that if someone buys it from the wife first and then buys it from the man, that's good. That's the proper way to do it. And that is a valid sale. But if he does it in the wrong order and goes to the husband first and only then buys it from the wife, then it's no good unless she writes a guarantee. So you see, she has to write a guarantee saying that if there was a prior lien on the land and someone else comes and takes it, then I'll make sure to pay you back. If she writes that, then you know she means it. So you see, the writing of achrayut, that was the same language as Shemuel. And so too in the case of the sikarikon, it would be valid if you do it in the wrong order, only if there's achrayut. But shtar wouldn't be enough, a challenge to Rav. And the answer is Nema Tevet. So this is a question, Nema Tevet Yuted Rav. Does that refute Rav? Not necessarily. Amalach Rav, my achrayut na meshtar. When it says here achrayut, and the statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he didn't mean davka, that has to be a guarantee. Rather means with a bill of sale, which usually goes along with a guarantee. But that didn't mean necessarily that it has to have the guarantee clause. What he meant by achrayut is that she's writing it up in an official bill of sale. So that's sufficient, and so not a problem for Rav. Next, Rabbanan לקח מן הסיכריקון ואכלה 3 שנים בפני בעלים וחזר ומכרה לאחר, אין לבעלים על הלוקח שני כלום. If you have a case of someone who buys land from sikarikon. Now, we said before that the original owner has first right to buy it back, right? But if he doesn't, then someone else buys it, then he has to pay a quarter. But what about the following case? Someone buys land from the sikarikon, and he uses the land for 3 years. That's called a hazakah. And then he goes and sells it to someone else, a second buyer. And then all of a sudden the original owner wakes up and says, hey, that was my land, right? It was taken by force from me. And he goes to the second buyer. The second buyer does not have to respond. The original owner has no claim against the second buyer. Okay, that's what the Braita says. Now we're going to analyze what is the case talking about. Now a little background about how chazakah works. Chazakah means squatting for 3 years in a house or using a land for 3 years. In halakha, there's no such thing as squatting rights. Just because, I went on vacation or something and I left the door open and someone comes and sits and lives in my house for 3 years doesn't give them a claim to it. So they don't own it just because they're sitting and living there. They also need a claim of how they rightfully got it. So chazakah can work as a proof, but not a claim. So in general, if I buy a house, so I need a claim and proof, but both of those come together. If I have a deed of sale, so the deed says that the way I got it rightfully from you is that I bought it, and the proof is, here I have a deed of sale. In the case of a chazakah, you need not only to be there for 3 years, but also a claim. You gave it to me as a gift, and I sat here for 3 years. I can't just claim, I know you never gave it to me, but I was sitting here for 3 years and you never complained, therefore it's mine. No, that's not sufficient. Okay, so with that background, let's see. What are we talking about? If the second buyer comes and makes a claim and says, listen, I bought it from the first buyer, and the first buyer, he bought it from you. In fact, he paid off the sikarai, whatever, 3/4 of the price, and he also went and paid you your quarter according to the law of the sikarikon, and therefore he legally got it. So, in that case, you don't need a second buyer. Even the first buyer would be believed in such a case. In other words, this baraita is creating a scenario in which the chazakah is sufficient to be believed, and there's the original owner has no claim. But we don't have to make such a complicated case where he was there for 3 years and he sold it to someone else. If one person, he came and he's there for 3 years, and the original buyer comes and says, hey, that's my land, and they're in court, and then the one who bought it, the one who's sitting here for 3 years says, well, not only did I get it from the sikarai, I also bought it from you. I paid you a quarter. Then he'll be believed, right? And he doesn't need a deed of sale, because that's how it works. A chazakah plus a claim, even if he doesn't have proof for the sale, he doesn't need a proof, because the fact that he's sitting there for 3 years and the other guy didn't say anything for 3 years, that itself is proof. So then you don't need a buyer. The second buyer. And if there's no claim, and he doesn't say that he bought it from you, then even the second one is insufficient. So if I took the land, I got the land from the sikarai, I'm in possession, I sit there and use it for 3 years, and then I sell it to someone else, and the original owner comes and says, hey, that's my land, and he does not claim that I bought it from you. They make no claim at all. I don't know, I just sat here and no one complained, and I sold it to him. Well, then that doesn't help. You can sell it 10 times, but there's still no valid claim of how it transferred ownership. So then that wouldn't work. So with a claim, you only need one buyer. Without a claim, even 2 buyers doesn't help. So what is the situation of this braita? Amar Rav Sheshet olam tela kata'in le. U'gon ze to'anim leyoresh ve'to'anin lalokeach. Rather, Rav Sheshet explains, it's talking about a case where the second buyer didn't make a claim, because he doesn't necessarily know how the first buyer got it, right? He comes, first buyer says, I have this for sale, I have the Brooklyn Bridge for sale, I don't know, whatever, however he got it, right? You're going to give it to me, I'm going to sit there, good. So the second buyer doesn't necessarily even know if the first buyer paid off the sikarai, if he bought it from the original owner or not. So he doesn't make any claim at all. But in cases like this, the court makes a claim on behalf of him, like they do for an heir. An heir, right? Someone makes a claim against an heir, but the heir doesn't necessarily know what, let's say, was their father, how their father got ownership of this item or not, and so they don't know how to make a proper claim. If the court sees that the heirs have a proper claim that they could give, then the court does it on their behalf. And the same thing here with the second buyer. He's not, if he says, there was no way that if he knows for sure that it was never acquired properly, okay, then there's no claim. But he doesn't know, and therefore the court says, since it could be that the first buyer received it appropriately by buying it, therefore we can leave it in your hands. And this would be helpful, because that way it will remain in Jewish hands. The other part, the first buyer, in other words, if there's no second buyer, well then, if he has a claim and says, I paid you your quarter, then he can keep it. If without a claim, he cannot keep it. Chazakah by itself doesn't work. Good, we solved that question. Tenor banan, haba mechamat chov u mechamat an parot en bo mishum sikarikon. Now we're talking about a case similar to the sikarikon. If some non-Jew comes and takes property because of a debt, or seizes it for some other reason, but not justly, because even for a debt, you still have to go to court and, and do things in the right way. So someone comes and takes a Jew's land. We do not apply the law of sikarikon. We don't have the special leniency. And if someone else, a buyer, comes to that non-Jew and buys it, it's an improper sale, and he has to just give the entire land back to the original owner, who is the proper legal owner of it. And we don't have a leniency that you only have to pay him a quarter. No, there's nothing like that. This is just plain old stealing. Now the Baraita has a curious phrase, "V'an parot atzma tzricha shetiyeh shenem asar chodesh." Unjust seizing of land has to remain in the possession of the thief for 12 months. No one can buy it for 12 months. So this second line, we're strange. So we ask about it. Hamat en ba mishum sikarikon. You said that the law of sikarikon doesn't apply, but this is one of the laws of the sikarai, that for 12 months, this is the betin of Rabbi said that the original owner has a right for 12 months to buy it, and only afterwards, then anyone else can come and buy it. So, but you said that the law of Sikarai doesn't apply, and now you're saying it does apply, that there's a difference between before 12 months and after. So we say, Hachikama, Sikarikon asma, Siricha shetishhe, shenem asar chodesh. No, this line of Anparot is referring to the Sikarai law. We're just clarifying something about the Sikarai. So Anparot, it means unjust seizure of land, and the Resha is talking about not at the time of war. And the Anparot, the second half, is talking about the aftermath of the time of war, when the law of Sikarai applied. Okay, so therefore we can just analyze the first half of it. Amar Rav Yosef Naktinan and Anparot beBavel. Rav Yosef says there is no seizure of land in Bavel. Right? No one steals land in Bavel. We ask, wait a minute, we see that all the time. We see this thugs, people stealing people's land in Bavel too. No, what we meant to say is that there's no special law about stealing the land that's seized in Bavel. In other words, so now we have three sets of laws, right? We have the law of the Sikarai, we talked about that. The law of the Anparot in Israel is that if I buy land that was stolen, it's an invalid sale, and I have to give it back to the original owner. But in Bavel, a third type of law applies. In Bavel, there is a regional government, and they're accessible, and I guess they're more or less fair. And so if if your land is stolen and you don't go complain to the government, then that means you waived your right to it and you don't care. Therefore, if I go and buy it from the thief, it's a valid sale. So, if you're in a place like Bavel, where there is a good government and legal system, then you have an obligation, if your land is stolen, to go and report it. If you don't report it stolen, well then, we have to assume that you don't care about it, and you gave up. Oh, my land was taken, what am I going to do? And in that case, if you gave up on it, then the thief owns it, and if I buy it from the thief, now it's good, it's mine. Gidel abar re'ilai kabil ar'a betaska mibene baga akadem ve'aheb zuze ditlat shenin. We have a story about this guy Gidel ben Re'ilai. He received land from the residents of a valley in exchange for the payment of land tax. Here's how it works. The people in this valley, they all collected their land tax together, and they paid it to the government as one. The government said, we don't want to go and collect money from each one of your homes. Rather, you all, this whole city, you collect your own taxes and you give us one lump sum. And therefore, so they're all responsible, and they would divide up the tax according to the size of each person's land. Now, what do you do if someone goes away and they're not going to work their land for a certain time? Well, that guy's away, so he's not going to pay the tax, and his land is not producing anything. That means everybody else is going to have to pay more on his behalf, so they don't want to do that. Instead, they made an agreement. Listen, if you're not working your land for this season, then we're going to bring in someone else to work the land on your behalf, and so that they will pay the tax. And so that would be a deal. That's the deal they made with this Gidel by the Eli. Listen, we'll give you the right to use this land for a year, as long as you agree to pay the tax. And anything more that the land produces, then that will be yours. So it's a good deal all around. Gidel can make some money, and the rest of the residents don't have to put up money for the tax of that land. Now, this guy Gidel, he went ahead on his own accord and paid the tax in advance for 3 years. Not just for the first year, he paid 2 more years in advance. Either he put it into the communal fund or he gave it to the government, whatever. He wanted to jump the gun. But in the end, the owners, the rightful owners of that land, came back home after 1 year, and they said, "Okay, give us our land back. Right now, we're gonna farm it again, and we'll pay the tax." For 1 year, right, you got the produce and you paid the tax. Very good. Thank you very much for doing that. And now we're back. We'll pay the tax and we will consume the produce. See you later. Here's the thing. This Gidel said, wait a second, I already prepaid the tax for the next 2 years. Therefore, I should get to keep the land and use it and produce and get his produce for the next 2 years, or pay me back for the next 2 years of the taxes that I prepaid. So this was the dispute. And they came to Rav Papa. Savar michtav le tirpa abene baga. Rav Papa at first was going to rule on the side of Gidel and write a document of authorization to Gidel that he can go and take possession of that land for the next 2 years and work the land because he already prepaid the taxes. So that gives him the right for the produce for the next 2 years. And so Rav Huna tells Rav Papa, that's no fair. You're making this like a Sikarai case. Right? In the Sikarai case, we say, listen, if someone steals your land, then you still have to pay that person. You still have to pay the Sikarai to get it back, and then you just give the original owner a little bit, a quarter. So you're making it like this. This guy Gidel, who asked him to prepay? Nobody asked him to prepay. He did it himself. And now it's like he's forcing himself and taking the land. And now the original owners are not going to be able to keep the produce. It's really theirs. So we understand in a case of emergency to get the land of Israel back into Jewish hands. Okay, then the rabbis made a special law of sikarikon. But why are you doing it and treating the original owners unfairly? Just because Gidel did this? Ela maravuna bered Rav Yoshua hiniach ma'otav al keren hasebi. Gidel, it's like he put his money on the horn of a deer. You take money, put on the horn of a deer. The deer is going to run away faster than you can. You put your money in jeopardy. Who asked you to do this? Nobody did. So you go try to get your money back from the tax authority. Or maybe if you gave it into the communal pool. Okay, try to get it back from the communal pool. What does that have to do with the rightful owners of this land? They went away for 1 year. So what? They don't deserve to lose out on the next 2 years of their land. And so Rav Huna corrected the ruling of Rav Papa. Next, זו משנה ראשונה, בית דין שלאחריהן אמרו, הלוקח מן הסיקריקון נותן לבעלים רבייה. So the Mishnah taught that what was the original law, that you had to buy it from the original owner and then the sikarikon. And the next court came and said, actually, you buy it from the sikarikon, and to the ba'alim you only give a quarter. Amarav, Rebia bekarka or Rebia b'ma'ot. Ushmal amar Rebia bekarka shehen shelish b'ma'ot. Now there are 2 ways to calculate how much the quarter is that I have to pay the original owner. According to Rav, I can choose either a quarter of the land price or a quarter of the amount that I paid to the Sikarai. Shmuel says, no, it will be a quarter of the original land price, which is a third of the amount that I give to the Sikarai, which will end up being more. So let's give an example. Let's say the original land price is $500. So according to Rav, the sale price is going to be a quarter, the amount that I have to give to the other guy, to the original owner, is a quarter, and I could choose either a quarter of the sale price. That'll be a quarter of 500. That'll be 125. Or if I want, I could do a quarter of the sale price. And the sale price, let's say, is 400. And so I only have to pay him 100 out of the 400. So I can choose, according to Rav, either a quarter of the original price or of the actual sale price that he gave to the Sikarai. So I'm always going to choose the lesser one, probably. And so that, therefore, according to Rav, I, the buyer, only have to give the original owner 100, and that's a quarter of the price that I actually paid to the Sikarai. According to Shemuel, however, it's a quarter of the land, which ends up being a third of the sale price. So the land, again, let's say is 500. A quarter of that, of 500, is 125. That's how much I have to pay to the original owner, 125. And then assuming that the rest of it is what I paid to the Sikarai, right, we're assuming that the original owner altogether is paying no more than the actual sale price of the land. So that would be split 375 and 125. So 375 to the Sikarai, 125 to the original owner. So that would be a third of the sale price, which is a quarter of the original price. So that's what Shemuel means here when he says a quarter of the land and a third of the sale price. So in the end, according to Rav, I would have to pay him 100. According to Shemuel, 125. Now, why? What's the essence of their argument? So it just depends on how you figure out a quarter. Is it a quarter of what's left or a quarter of the original amount? Mor sabar nechi rebiya zabin or mor sabar nechi chumsha zabin. According to Shemuel, it's a quarter less than the original land value. Original land value was 500. A quarter of that is 125. That's what I pay. According to Rav, on the other hand, ends up being a fifth. The original amount is 500. I only pay the other guy 1/5, 100 of that. But still, the Mishnah says a quarter. So, but that's still a quarter because it's, according to Rav, a quarter of the sale price. According to Rav, it's a quarter of the land price. Alright, Me'etibe, Zo Mishnah Rishona, Betin shel Achrehen Amru, Halokech min Sikarikon, Noten la Be'alim Rabia, V'yad Be'alim al ha'elyona, Rasu bekarka notlin, Rasu be'ma'ot notlin. Emata bizman she'en bi'adan likach, Aval yesh bi'adan likach, hen kodmin lechol adam. And so now we have a challenge, because the Mishnah said that was the original law. But then that later Bet Din came and said that someone who buys from this, the original law was you have to buy it from the original owner first and then from the Sikarai. But then the Bet Din came and said if you're buying it from the Sikarai, that's okay, and then you just have to go and pay the original owner a quarter, and the hand of the original owner takes the advantage. In other words, if there's any ambiguity into the price, a quarter of this or a quarter of that, it's the original owner who gets to decide. Which would mean the original owner would say, I want the higher amount, the 125, right? And if they want the karka, if they want a quarter of the full amount of the land, they can take that. If they want a quarter of the sale price, for example, let's say the Sikarai demanded more than the usual sale price, and so a quarter of that would be more, then the original owner can demand that. And so what you see here is that the original owner can demand the higher of the two, and that would be according to Shemuel. However, this is not the end of the story. The Braita, this is a Braita all elaborating on our Mishnah, continues and says, Ematai, when is that true? Bisman she'en bi'adan nikach, aval bi'adan nikach, hen kodbin lechol adam. That's only if the original owner does not have enough money to buy it himself. But if he does have enough money, then he precedes anyone else. Then, we have a next step. Rabbi Hoshi Bet Din v'nimnu. She'im shahata b'fnei sikarikon 12 chodesh, kol hakodem likach zacha. If the sikarikon are holding on to it for 12 months or more, then that's it. The original owners lose their right to redeem it first, and anyone who wants can come and buy it. But even though they buy it and they don't have to get permission from the owners for its first right of refusal, nevertheless they still have to pay them something. And they have to pay, the buyer after 12 months has to pay the original owner a quarter either of the land or of the money. That that agrees with Rav. Rav is the one that you said you can pay. The buyer can choose whatever he wants, whichever is less, a quarter of the total land amount or a quarter of the actual price. So this is a proof for Rav and a challenge to Shemuel. Amar Rav Asher, Kitanya hi lachar shebao ma'ot liyado. Rav Asher says, no, I can reconcile it with Shemuel as well. And that when it says here, a quarter of the land, well, that's what Shemuel said, right? If the land was worth 500, then I ought to pay him 125. That would be a quarter of the land. And when it says ma'ot, it doesn't mean a quarter of the price, the money that I gave to the Sikarai. That was only 375. But rather it means a quarter after the payment is already given. Then you take the total amount that I paid altogether, and the amount that I gave the original owner would be a quarter. In other words, I paid the Sikarai 375. So it actually is going to be a third of that, but a third is also a quarter if you count the total. So a third of 375 is 125. But if you take the total amount that I'm paying, 375 to the Sikarai and 125 to the original owner, and add that all together, that makes 500. And 125 is a quarter of the total amount being paid. And so that's what it says. Rabbi Abba Ma'ot, that's how it's calculating a quarter after the payment is already given and added into the total from which the quarter is taken, which ends up being the same as 1/3. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.